Things are okay, I guess. Not great. Tim West asks, how can an atheist believe in souls? There are many atheists who believe in supernatural things. They just don't believe in a God. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Cool. You mentioned corporate responsibility and worker democracy. Could you tell me more about those? In the Discord, you mentioned it sometime.
Even worker ownership partially, if we're talking about, corporations giving stock ownership plans to employees, stuff like that. I mean, I think those can result in positive outcomes. So that's my broad scope.
All right, so more generally, conversation on like capitalism versus socialism or communism. Which one would you? How would you frame that? I prefer
How would I
capitalism.
frame? Yeah, I mean, I'm a capitalist. I think that private ownership and markets and the profit motive, I think that all is good in the sense that it can be good, have some good outcomes associated with it. Um, yeah, I mean, that's how I would frame it. I mean, a lot of people will say I'm not a capitalist because I think that some national industry or collective ownership, state ownership can be a good thing, but I feel like it's, fairly it's a somewhat unimpeachable position of mine. I think most people would agree with me in that regard. I
Yeah,
guess
for
it's just
sure.
a
That's
matter
just
of
a
scale.
mixed economy. So that wouldn't be not capitalist. That would just be most of the capitalist economies right now.
Yeah, that's kind of where I fall on it as well. I think, personally, that's how I would feel. I don't think that, just because you have government spending or welfare doesn't make your economy socialist or not capitalist. I think that most every country operates fundamentally with a capitalist mode of production, private ownership and whatnot. So,
For sure. One of the things I think is interesting about the debate between socialism, communism, and capitalism is I think that if any of the communists or socialists think that their system could work, I think they should band together with the rest of BreadTube and start a company and actually demonstrate it. I think that would be a great method to actually demonstrate that their ideas work rather than just talking about it, because I don't think there are many successful countries or examples that can use those models. And so, of those debates, it seems much more forceful for them to actually do something rather than just talk about it.
yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I mean, people can do whatever they want with their money, assuming the government says it's okay, I suppose, within regulation. And if people want to do that, they can. I think that it just depends on the model people advocate for. I mean, there are socialists that aren't particularly enamored with worker cooperatives. There are socialists that have there's many disparate views on what worker cooperatives would even look like in each socialist's system. Uh, and then there are some socialists who believe in things like sovereign wealth fund style socialism, state ownership, right, where the whole idea of like democratizing the micro level workplace just isn't really necessarily a focus. So, it always depends.
Cool. Could you tell me more about your position in politics and economics in general?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a person on the left. I'd call myself a left capitalist, progressive Democrat, pretty bog standard progressive Democrat in many respects. To the annoyance of many, my preferred candidate in 2020 was Elizabeth Warren, but I strategically voted for Bernie in the primary. And I like I like Bernie. I like Warren. I don't agree with everything they have to say, but they're pretty good in my view. Right now, my favorite politicians are probably Ro Khanna, Katie Porter. I like those two. Probably those are my two favorites. Although I'm not a Californian. Um, and that's kind of where I am. I would call myself a contemporary social democrat.
Cool. I'm more of a centrist, so I think that Republicans are right about a
Wow.
couple of things occasionally, and libertarians are right about a couple of things occasionally. Um,
Sure, sure. I mean, I
don't
would agree with that as well. Obviously, it just depends.
for sure. I don't really like any of the current politicians. I think they're all kind of useless, and I think that they're just head pieces, and putting them in power probably wouldn't change much of anything. Even if we got Bernie, I don't think he would be able to do much unless he got all of the House and all of the Senate and got them with actually competent senators who weren't just waved the party flag. So I don't think even if we got Bernie, much would change.
I mean, maybe it's hard to say because I think that presidents do have a lot of power to really shift discourse. I think that Bernie, even outside of the presidency, has significantly shifted discourse to the left, at least amongst Democrats. And I think without a doubt, we could also agree that Trump has, to a very, very significant degree, shifted discourse, you could say to the right, but really towards, I don't know if you could strictly call it to the right, just towards an interesting direction in the Republican Party. And that's basically been completely because of Trump. I mean, people listen to him because he's a national public figure. And, same thing with Bernie, right? So I think politicians, even without complete control of government, legislative authority, can still have a pretty significant impact on the systems that govern us. Not to mention the fact that, I mean, the president alone has so much rulemaking authority and executive power that, I mean, it's definitely very important who's president, even if they have a split government.
I guess in some way that's true, but I don't think it's significant enough. Like, I don't think Trump was able to do most of the things he wanted to do because the standard Republicans stopped him on most of the things he wanted to do. I think the
Yeah,
same thing would happen to Bernie. Like, most of the policies he would try to enact would get stopped by the standard party Democrats.
yeah, that's definitely true. I don't disagree with that. I think that when you're voting for a president, people have to realize you're often voting for the 10 to 20% of their platform that they care enough to really focus on when they're in office. And, I don't think any president left office saying they got everything they wanted done, maybe except for James K. Polk. He said, I'm gonna do everything in one term and then I'm not running for election. And that's exactly what he did. But it's a rare thing to do that. And so, people have to be realistic in their expectations in some regard, right? Now, with regards to Bernie, like what would a hypothetical Bernie presidency look like? I mean, it would probably look somewhat similar to Biden's. I think Bernie would probably be even more sort of dovish on foreign policy than Biden has. But that's a very marginal thing, I would say. I think there'd probably be a really significant structural shift in a lot of foreign policy that we do if Bernie were president. And I think that with regards to the generic push for a lot of those initiatives, I think would become a lot more holistic in nature. Like, I think that if Bernie were president, he would just, like, I think he would have already tried to cancel student debt. Like, maybe the courts stop him, maybe something like that happens, but like that kind of stuff, like, I think Bernie would already do. I think he would really, really significantly push his executive authority. I think that there was even reports that came out where like his campaign was working with lawyers in the event that he won to just like how much of my platform can I do just with executive orders, and like how can we finagle different statutory authority to just use executive orders to do my platform. And I think that Bernie would probably he would be a lot more aggressive in that regard than Biden. Most likely, probably to some additional platform success than Biden, I would say. But that would be the main difference. I think I agree to a large extent that, of course, if Bernie were president, I don't imagine we would have Medicare for all. I don't think that would happen. We might have a public option, but definitely not Medicare for all, though. Not any of the big things. I don't think that he was advocating for.
What do you think would be the most positive, influential things the president could do with executive orders to shift the political landscape?
Well, to shift the political landscape, that's an interesting question. What do you mean by shift the political landscape?
Make things less shit. Just in general.
Okay, just to make things better. Yeah, that's a good question. What's the best executive order that I can imagine? That's a really good question. I think that the executive order that I can think of that would have the most impact the most positive impact. I think that a student loan forgiveness style executive order would be good. It would depend on the nature of the program. I think that's a pretty big power that the president has. I think that when we're talking about executive orders facing Americans, that's a little bit of a tougher conversation. There's a lot of foreign policy stuff that I can imagine. I would say that what the president could do right now that would make things a lot better for the American people would be two things having to do with capital and labor, right? So one thing is getting rid of a lot of these tariffs, working to scale them down. I think that that would be a pretty big thing that the president could be working on right now. And with regards to labor, I mean, frankly, I think that America should be more accepting of immigrants. I think that we've kind of gone away from that in many ways, and so the president could use probably some finagling in order to do something about, similar to a DACA style program, but a little bit more broad, trying to give people some relief in order to get documented, in order to especially let in people who, to me, there just shouldn't be any question whether they should be let in, accepting a lot more refugees from many places, accepting different sort of high skilled immigrants that we need, so I've talked about this before that to me, at least, if you got trained as a physician in Canada or in the UK, I mean, I don't see why you should have to redo your residency to come to America to practice medicine. I mean, if you want to come to America to practice medicine, we should probably trust the British and the Canadians to train their doctors. I'm sure we do. And so stuff like that, I think would go a pretty long way in terms of lowering prices for Americans and getting them access to goods that they want and services that they want.
And does the executive branch have power over those things? Because as far as I know, executive orders essentially only govern how the executive branch does things, right? It doesn't really have any effect over the judicial or the legislative.
Yeah, I mean, the executive order functionally, as far as I understand, is the president telling the executive to do something in a very formal sense. So, um, I think the answer is yes to both of those things. I mean, the president pretty much has almost unilateral authority over tariff policy. I mean, that's why Trump was able to, get us into so much, basically so much shit when it came to international trade when he was in office, because he could just do it himself. With regard to labor and accepting more refugees, I believe there is a cap on how many refugees we can accept. I think it's like 50 or 100,000. We should just accept the cap every year, and we should work to legislatively remove that cap, or at least to raise it to some extent. Because having some artificial cap on refugees, I can see leading to some problems down the line. And with regards to some humanitarian problems, and with regards to the broader sort of labor policy, I'm not really sure. It's an interesting question. I think that there's probably room for the president to do more with regards to executive action and immigration policy. After all, DACA came about via executive action. That's been proven to be a fairly robust policy of the federal government, and that was a pretty big deal, DACA was. So, I think that DACA or something similar could be enacted to help out other undocumented people in this country, and to the benefit of most Americans, I would say.
What is your position on the inflation we're seeing right now? Do you think that's Biden's fault? Thank you, Biden, the Twitter thingy, or do you think it's mostly Trump's fault in adding all the tariffs? And if it is Trump's fault, why is there such a delay after his presidency until we see the massive inflation?
No, I mean, I think that well, the tariffs are a problem, I would say, but then obviously Biden could just get rid of the tariffs. So I don't know if Trump, if we're blaming Trump for the tariffs that cause inflation, I don't know why we wouldn't blame Biden as well for not getting rid of them faster. He even doubled down on some of the tariffs, like on Canadian lumber, for instance, which I think is just crazy, frankly. But with regards to who's to blame for the inflation, I mean, I think that the COVID is mostly to blame for inflation. I think that when you lock down the economy and you curtail all these production processes and you force people at home, that seemed to not only make it very, very difficult for a lot of companies to put their production back online, it also fundamentally changed consumer behavior, right? So people started to spend a lot less on services and a lot more on durable goods, because we can imagine why. They might be working from home permanently or 2-3 days a week or something like that, or they may have had to get a new job that was more sort of less service oriented in nature, right? And so they want to upgrade their homes and they want to buy a lot of these durable goods, TVs, computers, vehicles was the one thing that, for a long time, it was just completely insane. It still is how expensive vehicles are, both new and used vehicles. So those things in conjunction is, to me, what's to blame for this sort of persistent inflation. People talk about the Ukraine war. I mean, that's a big deal as well. When you start to see a lot of food protectionism around the world in response to the Ukraine war. That kind of is a it's definitely had a spillover effect, right? And so I think that that's certainly to blame as well. And then people also talk about the stimulus, right? You know, passing $5 trillion worth of stimulus from an American perspective. You know, how much did that contribute to inflation? The analyses that I have seen have put the American Rescue Plan at responsible for between 1% and 3% of the current inflation. So call it, 2%. And I would just say that, well, obviously, that's more than zero, right? But I think the analyses that I've also seen have said that the ARS led to millions of jobs being created, right? So that's kind of the trade-off, right? Is 1 or 2% inflation worth those jobs being created, those people being sort of given that relief? And to me, I would say yes. And I think that inflation is going to start. I think we'll start to see disinflation in 2022. I think that we'll probably end the year at, I don't know, if I had to give a hard prediction, it would probably end the year between 4 and 6% inflation. And then the predictions that I've seen is that it would come down in line with expectations in mid 23. So, I trust those forecasts. To me, it seems reasonable.
Well, first question for you is why? Why do you think it would come back down next year? It seems a little sudden. I think it's going to last a little longer than that. And the second question is, what do you think about the windfall tax? Do you think that all the inflation is something that's actually necessary for companies, or do you think oil companies are essentially just gouging people and making record profits off of it?
Yeah. Well, two things really is that I think that it's interesting how persistent this inflation is going to be. It's really hard to predict because some of the analyses that I've seen have shown that the consumers aren't really, it doesn't seem like they're responding to the inflation, right? So in theory, if to some extent inflation should be a self-solving problem, right? If prices are going up and up and up and incomes aren't keeping in line, well, people would curtail their consumption to where domestic producers or domestic importers have to bring down their prices because people aren't buying as much stuff. But it seems like the consumer is still really, really aggressive in this economy for one reason or another. And so to what extent are we going to imagine inflation being persistent? It's hard to say. All I can say is the forecast that I've seen is that we'll see a lot of disinflation throughout, 2022 and then into 2023. Part of that is on the back of some markets cooling down. Like I've seen some analyses about housing cooling down, which in theory should have some downward pressure on, mortgage prices and rent prices, which would probably be good for people. To some extent, I think that the forecasts that I've seen, and at least the analysis I'm able to do on energy, which is definitely a primary thing causing a lot of this inflation right now, is that those prices have probably peaked for one reason or another. We could talk about that, but I think that's pretty reasonable assumption. And if anything, it might come down in the future with a lot of these new drills, a lot of these new wells getting drilled and stuff like that, which I would expect. But that even might be persistent with investor expectations. So that's hard to say. But the biggest thing is obviously just the Fed raising rates, right? I mean, making it more expensive to lend, more expensive to invest. It's definitely going to curtail a lot of this sort of, economic activity. And I expect that the Fed is credible and those rates will continue to get raised. I think that what the Fed's already guided, which was like, oh yeah, we're going to do 0.5 point increases until we start to see really, really drastic decreases in inflation, which isn't unprecedented. I mean, the Fed tends to just raise rates until inflation goes down, right? Whether it causes a recession or not. So whether we see a recession in 2023 or not, I mean, the Fed's going to keep raising rates until those inflation rates come down. And by the end of the year, what is that, like, 3-4% interest rates? If they keep on raising it like that, that's assuming the 50 basis point raise is the minimum, right? I'd imagine they'd probably become more aggressive, especially in response to this latest report. So, I wouldn't really be surprised to see stuff like that happen. And especially the fact that this inflation is kind of a global problem. I mean, the central banks across the world are starting to raise rates. So, I mean, there's no, there's no capital, there's no way to avoid the rate increases to a great extent, at least if you want to do business in the developed world.
Cool. And your thoughts on companies? Are companies genuinely raising the prices for actual reasons, or just costing people money because they want profit?
It's a great question. A lot of people have advocated that we should have some sort of special tax on billionaires or on big corporations or something. I mean, look, I mean, are some companies probably raising prices more than just to maintain their current profit margins? I mean, probably, right? That's definitely happening. But it's just a matter of like, number one, to what scale is that happening? And then number two, what can the government really do about it? So to answer the first question, I don't think that it's happening to a scale that we could really blame like even close to most of the inflation on that. I think that most of the prices that you're seeing increasing are because of genuine supply chain pressures and like changing consumer behavior. And I don't really think I don't think it's mostly because of companies just raising prices. I mean, people talk about like people have talked about like the dollar store, right? The dollar store is raising, or Dollar General is, raising prices to 125 or whatever it is, taking advantage of this. And even though they had record profits or whatever it was, and it's like, okay, well, look, I mean, you gotta think like, what does the Dollar General sell, right? They sell basic little bullshit things, and basic little bullshit things like, basic food products or like very cheap consumer goods. Those are really competitive markets, right? And I don't think the Dollar General could just get away with like raising a shitload on their prices relative to their competitors, because it's a fairly competitive market for goods. So, you know, it's happening, but I don't think it's I don't think it's most of the inflation. How do I feel about a windfall tax? I mean, it's never going to happen in America, I don't think. So I'm not sure how much it's worth really considering. I think the big thing with the windfall tax that we have to keep in mind is that corporations pass on some of their corporate tax to consumers anyway, right? So to what extent are we just basically causing the problem to be worse by taxing corporations? To me, it's, inflation is kind of a holistic issue in terms of how to solve it. And I don't think that, I'm not sure I'm convinced by any of the analyses that would show that a windfall tax would significantly curb inflation. It just doesn't, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think there's better ways to help consumers in this environment that don't necessarily, might end up backfiring, I guess. So.
Like what do you think would be other good ideas to help us?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that, well, I would say that you could. I've been thinking about this for a while. So, um, people talk about oil companies, I guess, like gouging consumers and stuff like that. And I think that it's true and it's not true, right? So, gas stations aren't really gouging consumers that much because most gas stations you don't make a ton of money from the gasoline that you sell. It's the oil sort of producers, right? The upstream people that are making the huge margins as a result of, oil being however many, 100 plus dollars a barrel it is right now. And so with regards to how to help them, we have to look at, why are oil companies seeing $100 barrel oil, and why aren't they drilling more? Why are they curtailing their investment? And it seems like the plurality of, well, not the plurality even. I mean, I think I saw a survey and it was like 70-80% of the people of the executive surveyed said that it was because investors don't want to drill a ton. They want two things. They want return on their capital. They want dividends. They want stock buybacks. They want us to pay down debt because the oil investor has been, I mean, basically taking a beating for the last, 10 years because, the economy was near collapse in 2008. Oil prices sunk. The 2016 oil glut, which led to so many bankruptcies and so much layoffs. And then obviously in 2020, when oil prices went negative, same thing, so many layoffs, so many bankruptcies, so much curtailment. And so the oil investors are demanding, hey, we don't want you to drill more. We want you to return capital. And so I think that this is actually one of the incredibly rare instances where some sort of price control might actually lead to more drilling. If you look at economic theory with regards to how monopolies react to price controls, by the economic theory, if you implement a price control in a monopolized market or in a market with these sort of incentives, it would actually lead to more output. And so I think something like that could be interesting to experiment with. I think that Warren proposed something similar by having a price cap on gasoline. I just don't know if the gasoline makes as much sense as the oil. And I think that would lead to a lot less pain at the pump, let's say. People talk about nationalizing oil fields to try and get rid of that sort of pressure. I think that could work as well. I mean, I'm not sort of ideologically against sort of national industry with regards to resource cultivation. I'm not sure how it could be done. You have to keep in mind that these are, you're giving these powers to the government permanently. So, do you want Trump to run the national oil company? Like, maybe. I mean, but that's a little bit scary. It just depends on how it's structured and how it's governed. But stuff like that, I think could make some sense.
I'm a big advocate for like copying other countries. I think that's the best strategy in order to try and find what an effective policy is. So, like, I think Finland has the best education system. They use a voucher system. We should just copy Finland. And I think that many countries that do have nationalized oil companies do very well. I forget what the other one is. Venezuela has a big amount, but there's some country like Norway or Sweden
Yeah.
or something, and they have like
Yeah,
equally as
many,
much.
many, many countries have national oil companies. I mean, Brazil, Mexico, Norway, obviously Venezuela, most of the Middle East. I mean, national resource companies aren't new. I mean, obviously even, things like the Chilean copper mines, that there's big national industry there as well. So, um, it's not the most unusual thing to have national industry related to, resource cultivation. So, I don't think it'd be the most unreasonable thing. It sounds like quite a radical policy, but I mean, like you said, the truth is a lot of countries do it, and it seems to work out for them. So, what can you say?
Yeah, so I think we should, if there's a successful model in another country, we should be able to copy it, no problem. And then, but the Republicans say, oh, but we just have a different culture. Our just culture is just so sufficiently different. We couldn't just copy other countries' metrics. What do you think about that argument?
I That's one of the most annoying arguments that I hear, and it's always veiled in this weird racist style rhetoric where it's like, well, I mean, we couldn't have all of those social welfare programs and all that national industry over in Nordic countries because they're just so homogenous, right? They're very homogenous people. It's like I don't know what about having a lot of black people or Hispanic people in your country all mixed together causes you to just not be able to run a national oil company or just not be able to run a national healthcare system. I mean, I just don't think I just don't think that's a very reasonable criticism. I mean, heck, even Brazil, right? Brazil's a very diverse country. They have a national oil company. They have a national. I think they have the largest single payer system in the whole world. It's not to say that Brazil's perfect, but I mean, those are some pretty popular programs over in Brazil. So, I mean, clearly, at least the government's doing something right that the people like. To the extent that even right wingers like Bolsonaro aren't going to dismantle those systems. So, I don't know. I just don't. The whole like diversity is a reason why we can't have national sufficient levels of government involvement in the economy or whatever. I mean, I've just never really quite resonated with those arguments.
Yeah, the thing I like to ask normally is what cultural difference could cause a particular policy to not work? And that's not a question I normally get an answer to. It's or at least a very vague answer to it. But yeah, do you have a position on vouchers? Because I like the voucher system in Finland. I think their education system is really good, and I think it would be good to implement it here. And that upsets many people on the left.
Um, I don't. I have to read more about this. Hold on, give me 1 second, because my understanding of the Finnish system was that it's. I don't know if it's a voucher system. I know a couple things well, I would say peculiarities. Let's just say, but not necessarily because obviously it works. But some things about the Finnish education system is that as far as I'm aware, there's no private schools really. You send your kids to public school. All public schools get the same funding, so there's not really a lot of, there's not a lot of, all schools are basically sort of competing on cost to some extent, right? So you don't have the rich kids going to really nice schools and the poor kids going to really crappy schools because of how they fund it, which is good. With regards to the voucher system, I've never heard of. I don't know what you're talking about with regards to the voucher system in Finland. I thought all schools were just basically just a public service in Finland, but maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know. I heard about it from a education documentary where they were going through the different education systems. They called it a voucher system. Not sure if that's correct or not, but it seemed more like that, where there's the parents and students could choose between the different schools. And I think there are
Yeah, I mean, it's
privately. I'm pretty sure
possible.
there. I think there is some private schools in Finland.
I'm not saying there's zero private schools in Finland. I'm not sure that that would be the case, but I do know that the private schools component of Finland is like relatively small. Like there's very few private schools in Finland relative to like America, where at least it seems like a lot of rich people tend to just send their kids to public schools in Finland, whereas in America you just send your kids to private school. And um, I'm not necessarily sort of practically against the idea of private school. I just think that, when I think that we as a society should do as much as we can to try and not segregate people based on income. Now, at the end of the day, rich people are going to live in nicer neighborhoods always, right? I mean, it's going to be hard to have like true diversity in all aspects of life with regards to, high income and low income people. But I do think that when we have like incredibly segregated societies based on income, that it probably leads to worse outcomes and more social ostracization, less empathy, um, things like that. So, to the extent that we can minimize that is positive. So one way to do that to me would be having equitable funding schemes for public schools, and just to me, just having a lot more funding for public education. Public education is a really good thing. So I like it.
So get rid of the make schools funded based off of the housing taxes.
Yeah, I think I think it's really hard to defend the idea that your public schools are paid for with property taxes, when that leads to such inequitable outcomes. I mean, in Finland, one other thing about their system is that you're not even allowed to accept donations from parents as a school, right? So basically, the only money that public schools in Finland can really use is the funding that they get from the state, right? So the idea is just that you can't in any way, sort of structurally advantage an area's schools just because it has a lot of rich people there. Now, again, that seems pretty extreme. It does work in Finland. I don't think that's tenable in America, but I think at the very least, collapsing the funding of public schools from property taxes into general treasury revenue, and then equitably distributing that, to me, makes a lot of sense. I mean, maybe allow people to fundraise and donate if they want, but yeah, I mean, the whole local property taxes going to being the primary funding source for schools. I mean, it's just a way to give poor schools less funding and rich schools more funding, and I don't know. It seems very unfair if we believe in a public education system. It's not the way to do it.
Do you have other examples of other things countries do really well that we don't do? Like one I can think of is healthcare in Singapore seems to work really well, and they have a more like capitalistic system, but it's works significantly better than our system.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a good private insurance that works. Look at the Swiss model or the Dutch model. They have all private insurance. The state barely pays anything for anyone's healthcare in those countries, but they have universal coverage. It is affordable, and it's quality, right? And so you can look at most of the developed world's healthcare systems and say that they're a lot better than America. And so I would say that we just kind of have to pick one of those models. America has this weird kind of Frankensteinian, just conglomerate of systems that doesn't really seem to work very well in tandem. But if we just picked a model and stuck with it, that would be a lot better. Whether it be a public option, single payer, national system, or a more sort of private oriented system like in Switzerland, or the Netherlands. You mentioned Singapore. I've heard some people talk about it. I haven't looked into it too much, but as far as I'm aware, Singapore kind of operates under a mandatory insurance style system like in Switzerland or the Netherlands, but I have to read more about it. But that, so yeah, I mean, I think healthcare is a good example. I would say that other things that countries do that I think we could do, I think we could stand to have a more subsidized education system, right? I don't think that you should never not go to school because of cost. And I don't really think you should have to take on debt to go to school, whether you're rich or poor. If you're worried about rich people going to college for free, just have a progressive tax system, which is what we already have. So if you're worried about, the two engineers that send their engineer kid to go get an engineering degree, and then he gets a $250,000 salary. It's like, okay, well, he's paying more taxes anyway, right? So I don't really see the problem with that. So um, that's one thing. Yeah, but healthcare is probably probably the best example that you could imagine. So
Thoughts on corporate tax rates, especially if you have like the headquarters in Ireland where it's like 0%? Is that, I think that's a good idea to have that kind of loopholes?
yeah, I did a video on corporate taxes. Corporate taxes aren't really the most effective form of taxation. Well, depending on what you care about, right? So like, if you care about income inequality, they're not a great form of taxation because you can just directly tax shareholders. You don't really have to tax like corporations. If you care about raising revenue, right, it doesn't really raise that much revenue to tax corporations. And if you care about workers, right, well, a lot of the corporate tax sort of obligation gets passed on to workers or through consumer or to consumers. And so, to me, it doesn't make as much sense to really care about the corporate tax rate. I think that it's valuable probably to still have some corporate tax rate. It's a tough sell though. I think that the value of a corporate tax rate is that it allows you to do ancillary policies. So, for instance, corporations do a lot to avoid corporate taxes, and that's including take advantage of policies that are there specifically to not pay corporate taxes, right? So, if you wanted to, for instance, incentivize like renewable energy, you can offer a tax credit to build and invest in renewable energy projects. Hey, invest in this, your taxes go down. Um, Now, the flip side of that is just to say, well, you could always just subsidize those things. Hey, we'll subsidize 20% of your capex cost if you invest in renewable energy. That's fair. I mean, maybe that makes sense. I don't know if the tools are there to do that kind of thing versus a tax credit. At least in America's federalized system, it seems like tax credits from the federal government are a pretty good way to direct investment in ways that we would find socially advantageous. So I think corporate taxes serve a purpose, but I just don't think, a lot of people advocate for raising them to 30, 40%, 50%. And I mean, I don't know. I think to me, it's a misunderstanding and misapplication of tax policy because, you know, if you care about those greedy shareholders, paying taxes, well, just raise the capital gains tax rate. I mean, like why would we, what materially is what makes a worker materially worse off, or what makes income inequality worse by a corporation having more cash in their treasury? Well, it doesn't, because the corporations they're not people, right? And a corporation having cash in their treasury doesn't make income inequality worse. What makes income inequality worse is taxing capital gains less than income, which is what we do now. So, I mean, I'm a big, to me, a big advocate for raising those taxes and doing a lot of other things to try and ensure that wealthy people pay more money into the system.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things I advocate for is a pay cap for CEOs and shareholders based on the number of employees they have, which would come in the form of a tax like that, a capital gains tax. Would you be for something like that? Would it be like a pay cap and you can pay yourself or you're taxed at a rate dependent upon the level you have of some employees paid at this amount of income per year, and the 30,000 to 50,000 and then the 50,000 to 100,000, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think a pay cap would be a good way to incentivize expanding workership?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think that I think we would just have a lot of like not misaligned incentives, but I think it's easy to get around that kind of thing. It's like, how do you define pay? How do you define compensation? I think that there's a lot of ways to just get around pay, like hard pay caps in terms of what you take home on a W-2. And I don't know if there's quite a great way around that, especially not in a way that makes the obligation on the corporations anyway, right? I think to me, if you care about if you care about workers being given a fair shake, a fair wage for a fair day's work, I think that two things, right? Progressive income taxes and higher capital gains taxes, those are pretty big deals. I think the capital gains taxes even arguably should be taxed higher than income. I'm pretty mixed on that, but I think it's inarguable they should be taxed as much as regular income. Eliminating the payroll tax cap, actually, right now, one of the big things to me that you could do to reduce income inequality is just tax people making over 100, it's like 115 grand. like actually make them pay payroll taxes. So if you don't know it, for every dollar you make over like 100, I think it's around 115 grand. If you make 400 grand a year, you only pay into the social security system up to 150 grand. And then that other, 285 something thousand dollars, you don't pay any social security tax on, which is completely insane. It's the most regressive tax that you can imagine, the most regressive way to tax that you can imagine. So something like that as well. And then other things, right? So like worker board membership, encouraging unionization, implementing policies to encourage that kind of thing, worker ownership, sovereign wealth funds. I think these are the ways that you can ensure that corporations act more sort of equitably and with more social awareness. To be fair, I think there's a big investor push to do that already. But I don't, to me, I wouldn't rely on the markets to do that kind of thing. So, that's where we would agree there's some policy that would need to be established. But no, I mean, to me, a pay cap is it's too simple a solution to a complex problem.
What are your thoughts on renewable energy? Do you think nuclear is a good solution, that we should go more nuclear?
Yeah, nuclear is fine. I think that what people have to keep in mind with nuclear is that it's not renewable, right? So if the whole world was run on nuclear, we'd have enough nuclear sort of usable nuclear material for about 40 or 50 years. And so it's not a renewable resource, nuclear energy. And so it's good, right? It's good for transition, but it's not a permanent source of energy, and it can't really be. And so it's important to realize that inevitably we're gonna have to have renewable energy be like the primary thing that we get our power from. There's really no other way around it. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do nuclear energy. I mean, I'd much rather build a nuclear plant than 100 gas plants. So this is kind of what we're doing now. That's a lot better for the environment. So I like nuclear, but it is important to realize that nuclear cannot obviate the need for the eventual, the eventual adoption of renewable energy that's going to happen. So.
Any other interesting ideas you have about what we could do to make things better? Other policy ideas?
It's a good question. It's a good question, T-Jump. To me, the number one, I think the first economic policy that I would pass if I was leader of the government would be 50% worker board membership for companies over like 100 or 200 employees. I think that, inviting workers to be part of the decision-making board of a company would probably lead to a lot less bullshittery, let's say, when it comes to how workers are treated. I think it would lead to probably higher incomes. It would probably lead to more respect for workers. And frankly, it'd probably just lead to better business practices. I mean, we've all worked at companies where, a policy comes down from corporate and it's a totally unrealistic policy. Why is that? It's because these guys are suits, right? I mean, a bunch of suits in a boardroom are not necessarily going to be able to, in every possible conceivable way, make the most sort of productive decisions for a company because they're so separated from that ground level of the work. And so injecting some worker voice into that process, I think, to me, would be a really positive step in the right direction. And there's a lot of studies out that show it has some pretty good outcomes. So I think that'd probably be my number one thing. I'm a big worker board membership guy.
What do you say about the conflict of interest between the workers and the leadership? Because the leadership see workers as an expenditure and they want to lower the cost of the expenditures as much as possible. And the workers want to, of course, increase their pay as much as possible. So doesn't that create a conflict of interest that makes it more difficult to have workers on the board?
No, I mean, that's a conflict that always happens. Labor is a market, right? It's a trade. When you're trading some amount of your sort of surplus value that you're creating, right? So corporations profit off of your labor. If they didn't profit off your labor, they wouldn't hire you. And so you're trading some amount of your end wage for an easy use of capital, right? I make a higher wage than I otherwise would if I had to start my own company by working for a company that's already established. So it's a fair trade in theory. The problem is that there's a lot of let's say potential coercion and market manipulation, toxicity that can happen in that market. And so we have to understand that, it's a market. That's not a bad thing. Obviously, there's some conflict inherent between managers and workers, but putting them all in a room together and forcing them to come to consensus or to a majority decision with mixed majorities, oftentimes with some workers siding with capital and some capital siding with labor on some decisions, that's important, right? And that process, I think, would be made more equitable if we did have 50% worker board membership rather than 100% capital board membership, which is, to me, leads to a lot of the problems that we see today. I can understand how a lot of employees feel resentful of their management because they don't get any say in corporate policy, really. And that's to me, that's unfortunate. I think that having half elected worker board members is a good counterbalance to this sort of increasingly divergent interest of capital in society.
And you said you've seen studies on that working well. Do you have where we can find those?
Yeah, sure. My first scripted video is about worker board membership. It's not my best video, to be fair, because it was my first one. But there's a lot of sources in there. You can just look up, worker board membership effects on, business productivity, labor wages, profitability, stuff like that. It's not universally positive, right? So obviously there's some studies that would show that there's negative effects in that regard. There's one study that I saw that showed that there was I think it was a negative effect on corporate profitability, but that was because wages got higher. So, sometimes that's the trade-off. It's not necessarily going to solve every economic problem, and it's going to have transition costs, and it's not going to be necessarily there's winners and losers with every policy that the government can enact. But I think that overall, it's really strong and positive policy. I think that in general, I'm pretty persuaded by the argument that in America, at least, we focus so much on redistribution. What welfare programs can we implement? How can we tax in such a way that leads to a more equitable society? But what we don't often talk about is pre-distribution, right? How can we encourage businesses at the corporate level, at the entity level, to just give their employees better benefits, right? And to me, the two main ways are unionization and worker board membership. Those are the two big ways that we could do that.
Awesome. Well, we've been going for about an hour. It was a really fun, pleasant conversation. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. And anything else you want to give, like a link to your YouTube channel where people can find you and your work?
Yeah, sure, guys. Well, hey, if you're a fan of T-Jump, then you can always come to man, sorry, I'm getting these weird spam guys in my chat here. But, you can always come over to econoboi.com, listen to me live stream. You can go to youtube.com/econoboi or on Twitch and go from there, guys. If you want to learn about economics, then go for it. Come and learn something. Or you can come and debate me and talk to me. So it's good talking to you, T-Jump. Glad you can make the time.
Yep. Thanks. And I will talk to you later. Peace out.
All right. See you, bud.